Good afternoon and welcome to ENG4E Term 2A, brought to you by WASA Distance Education Center. I am your instructor, Mike Laverty. Today is Thursday, February 23rd, 2023. We are already on class number 11, so things are flying by. We're about a third of the way through our classes, and we are still tackling Unit 2, discussing our novel, Where the Rivers Meet, and we're looking at key questions 23, 24, and 25 today. So the assignments are a bit different in this unit in that there's less of them. You have less key questions than you did in Unit 1, but the questions are much more, they're asking more of you, and they're much more detailed, and you've got to produce more content. Like, key question 23, we're going to keep coming back to it because it's the guided reading questions, and they cover every chapter of the book. So you need to stay on top of those. Let me just see. I think I misspoke in yesterday's class. There's actually 16 chapters in this book. 16 chapters. The book itself is 147 pages, so it's, as far as novels go, it's on the shorter end, but it is some fairly heavy reading. There's a couple of traumatic incidences in the book, and should have probably mentioned that on day one, but just I think it's important that students know that going in. There's a sexual assault, a rape in one of the chapters. It's not described in detail, but it does occur. So just keep that in mind. That could be kind of like a triggering thing to read, especially if you've experienced something like that or been in a similar situation. So yeah, the subject matter of this novel is very heavy. It does deal with trauma, and there's also a suicide. So lots of negative things happen to the characters in the book, but at the end, when you finish it, it's absolutely an uplifting experience, and I think it's a very powerful book. But yeah, I was thinking about that the other day, and should mention that to students. I apologize if you've already gotten into the book, but if you haven't started the book yet, just know that you're getting into some pretty intense territory, but it does teach a very powerful lesson. All right, so we are in week 3 of classes in Term 2A. We will meet for weeks 4 and 5. Then we'll take March break from the 13th to the 16th. And so no classes, no broadcast during that March break. Please join the new WASA Facebook group. If you're on Facebook and you search up WASA, you'll see a new page, and new is in the title, so you know you're on the right page. So we've finished Unit 1. We've done weeks 1. We've done weeks 2. We're finishing up week 3 today, and we'll spend 4 classes next week wrapping up Unit 2. But for now, we're still delving into Unit 2. So if you're tuning in on the radio live, that's awesome. Thanks for joining us. 91.9 FM. You can also listen on Bell ExpressVu, channel 972. If you want, and I strongly encourage you to do so, you can phone us at 1-800-465-7144 or the local number 807-737-4017. And you can phone in, ask a question. Monday through Thursday, 2 to 2:55 p.m. Central Standard Time. Sorry, 2:50. Keep forgetting to change that. And if you go to zoom.us and you put in the meeting code or a meeting ID, which is 417-6699-799, you can join us on Zoom. That is our meeting ID. I'm very pleased to see that people are watching the YouTube videos, so keep doing that. And uh, visit. There's 3 playlists. So there is one that just says Unit 2A, ENG4E, and then one of them is, sorry, that's not unit, that's term. So unit ENG4E term 2A, that's all the videos, and then there's Unit 1, and then there's Unit 2. So making it easier for you to find that contact. So if you're listening to us, or if you're watching on YouTube, then pause the screen and take note of the information on the board. If you're listening on the radio, just know that there's many ways you can submit your work. And if you have any questions on how to do that, please talk to your DEC. Talk to your learning center. Phone the WASA office. We'll walk you through it. There's many ways you can email work. Many ways you can send your work, like emailing it, scanning it, taking a picture of it, having your DEC send us a physical copy in the mail. So there's many ways to get your work in. When you do submit your work, please submit your work into small groups of, say, 5 to 10 assignments. Lesser is better than more. So, again, I mentioned yesterday, I love when students put the work in, but if you give me too many assignments, you miss the opportunity to have feedback on them, right? For example, like you could submit a couple of chapter reflections or a few of your guided reading questions for your chapters. I can grade them and then give you feedback and say, good work, but if you want to get more marks next time, maybe do this and that, right? So that's what I do, right? So when you hand in your work to me, I give you feedback, and my intent is for you to do even better next time. Be sure to write down your name, your community, the course code, and any other information you can think of about that assignment. Reach out to me at mlaverty@nnecschools.org. Find me on Facebook. Hit me up on Messenger at LavertyWasa. All right. Let's jump. Oh, sorry. So this is my 2-week suggested progress. You should have made contact with your teacher by now. That's myself. You should have read the study guide, Unit 1 and Unit 2. Should have the first 3 chapters of the novel read. Should have all of the key questions of Unit 1 taken care of. And started working on a rough draft of your culminating activity from Unit 1. So that is my suggested progress to you. I know that everybody works on their own pace, but I think it's important to stay on track. And even if you're an independent learner, I think it's best if you can complete the work on a set schedule and keep the material fresh in your mind. So here's today's lesson. We'll look at an article of the day from the Globe and Mail. We will discuss the guided reading questions. That's key question 23. We'll do chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8, I think, today. We'll discuss key questions 24 and 25, and we will review the writing process as it relates to composing a descriptive paragraph. So our learning goals for today are to break down a news report from a national newspaper, especially the headline, explore the elements of narrative and where the rivers meet. Remember, that's the elements of narrative are character, setting, plot, theme, narration, theme, conflict. Did I already say those two? And learn how to write a descriptive paragraph by using the writing process, right? So delving back into that writing process, the 5-step writing process of planning, writing, revising, editing, and publishing. And your success criteria, your own personal benchmark is use your understanding of novels and our selected novel to respond to several unit assignments from Unit 2 and to create a rough draft of key question 25, descriptive paragraph writing. So I want to walk you through the steps on how to get your paragraph started, how to plan it, and how to get a rough draft underway. All right, so here is our article of the day. This is from the Globe and Mail. I tried to find an article that had some connection, that had some relevance to where the rivers meet. So the headline of this article reads, Ottawa announces $2.8 billion settlement of BC residential schools class action lawsuit. So that's my headline. So news reports have headlines. That's the main idea. That's the big stuff you see at the start of the article. They'll also have a byline. And the byline tells us who wrote it. Let's do a different font. The byline tells us who wrote it, and where they wrote it, and when they wrote it. So this one was written by, it actually doesn't have an author. It just says the Canadian Press. Published January 21st, 2023. Updated January 22nd, 2023. Includes correction. So there you go. So there you go. That's good to note. So sometimes, especially when the article is online, sometimes they publish the article, and then someone will read it, and they'll post a comment on Facebook, or they'll email the news team, or they'll make contact with the newspaper in some way and say, "Hey, you guys made a mistake. You should have said this," and then they have to go back and correct it. Either just because they're responsible journalists and they want to put correct information out there, and then sometimes they want to avoid a lawsuit, right? So if you say something about someone that's not true, that's a big thing, and then sometimes it's just an honest mistake. So sometimes they have to go back and change things. The caption says, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Mark Miller speaks to the Assembly of First Nations Special Chiefs Assembly in Ottawa, December 8th, 2022. So they've got kind of like this random picture of this Crown Indigenous Relations guy, minister, speaking to the chiefs in British Columbia. And then the photograph is Spencer Colby of the Canadian Press. That's the guy who took this photograph of this minister. Okay, so there, and our headline again is Ottawa announces $2.8 billion settlement of BC residential schools class action lawsuit. So I've color coded the nouns in blue, the adjectives in orange, verbs in green, prepositions in red. And I just want to break down the parts of a sentence, right? So letters make up words, and words make up sentences, but there's also a step in between where words make up phrases and words make up clauses. And we combine phrases and clauses to make up a sentence, right? So remember, the most basic building block of a sentence is the clause. And a clause is a subject and a predicate. It's what the sentence is about, and then what that thing does, or what happens to that thing, or a description of that thing, right? So Ottawa is a noun. It's also the subject of our sentence, right? So it's a noun. It's a proper noun. And it's also an example of when, like in America, they'll say Washington does this, and when they say that, they don't mean the city of Washington, they mean the government. So when they say Ottawa announces, it's like the local government in Ottawa is making an announcement. Okay, it's like the federal government of Canada is making this decision. So Ottawa is our subject. Announces is what they did. Okay, so that's the verb / the predicate, right? Ottawa announces $2.8 billion settlement of BC residential schools class action lawsuit. So that's actually, I made a mistake there. This is actually a noun. And it's also the object. So Ottawa announces settlement. Those three words are like the framework of this sentence. Ottawa announces settlement. But it wasn't just any settlement. It was a 2.8 billion settlement. So 2.8 billion is an adjective that modifies the settlement. It tells me what kind of settlement. Okay? And then of is a preposition. Missing a P there. Preposition. Whoops. The P's in the wrong spot. Of lawsuit, right? Ottawa announces settlement of lawsuit. And now it's not just any lawsuit. It's a BC residential schools class action lawsuit. So I've got three adjectives that tell me what kind of a lawsuit I'm dealing with. It's a class action lawsuit, and a class action lawsuit is one that involves many, many people, right? So depending on what happened, class action lawsuits can involve hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals. So it's a class action lawsuit. It's a lawsuit about residential schools, but it's not just about that. It's about BC residential schools. So you see that when you write a headline or when you write a sentence, you have the basic meaning of the sentence, but then adjectives and adverbs, they modify and they add additional information, right? So hopefully that makes sense, and it's good just to break it down. Have a look at the article itself. So the federal government says it has come to a $2 billion agreement to settle a class action lawsuit brought by two British Columbia First Nations related to the collective harms caused by residential schools. At a Saturday morning news conference in Vancouver, that's a great example of a phrase, a prepositional phrase. They always end in commas. So at a Saturday morning news conference in Vancouver, comma, Crown Indigenous Affairs Minister Mark Miller said the government signed the deal with plaintiffs representing 325 nations that opted into the Gottfriedson band suit. Okay, so we got an introductory clause. We're getting more information. Let's see. Let's keep going. While settlements that are being, so this is a direct quotation, while settlements that are being announced like these today do not erase or make up for the past, ... That's the ellipsis. The ellipsis is a punctuation mark. That's a punctuation symbol. It's represented by 3 dots. They can't make up for the past, ... What it can do is help address the collective harm caused by Canada's past, a deeply colonial one, in the loss of language, the loss of culture, and the loss of heritage, said Mr. Miller. Okay, let's focus on that ellipsis, those 3 dots. So if you're a journalist and you're quoting someone in a newspaper article and you don't want to include everything they said, you can put the 3 dots in there. And the 3 dots tell me, the reader, that there's some words missing, okay? So you have to be really careful, because sometimes journalists can be selective, and they can delete a few words and then make the politician look like they're saying something they don't mean, right? So to do this correctly, you have to get rid of unnecessary words, or like repetitive words, or words that aren't going to help the reader understand the context. It would be like doing an interview with someone on TV and then like only showing the bad responses, or cutting up their responses to make the person look bad. So hopefully the journalist has done their work here, and they've used the ellipsis correctly. The lawsuit originally involved 3 classes of complaints and focused on harm suffered by students who attended the schools only during the day. But in 2021, all parties agreed to concentrate initial settlement efforts on survivors and their descendants to ensure they would receive compensation in their lifetimes. Okay, so I brought up this article to just look at some grammatical stuff, but perhaps more importantly, we can look at this article and say like where the rivers meet was published in the year 1988, at a time when things like residential schools were not talked about openly in the media, and I'm sure they were talked about, but you didn't hear about it in elementary and high schools. It definitely wasn't talked about when I went to school in the 80s, right? And so the things that Nancy's upset about in the book are people are trying to address them today, right? We had the apology for residential schools in 2008 by the then president Stephen Harper, and there's lots of class action lawsuits. They are finding lots of unmarked graves at these residential schools, right? So an interesting way to talk about the novel Where the Rivers Meet is to be like, okay, this book was published in 1988. What, if anything, has changed in 2023, right? So that's something you could talk about in your chapter reflections, when you talk about Nancy as a character, when you work on your culminating assignments, right? When you talk about let me just pull it up real quickly here. The culminating assignment is when you discuss the novel itself, right? Reflection, when you're reflecting on the whole novel as it goes, right? So that's an angle you might want to take when you talk about characters, plot, and theme. So, like, as we recall, the plot of a novel is simply what happens. It's this happens, then that happens, then this happens. The conflict is what moves the plot forward. But the theme is like the underlying, the true story, the deep story, the story that you've got to figure out, right? Like you could argue that Nancy is sort of, occupied with the plot of her life, and she's a high school student, and the next thing she has to do is to graduate, right? So she's kind of stuck on that like basic plot. But if we read this novel carefully, we can see that there's a deeper story here, and the deeper story is, it's her becoming an adult. It's her becoming a woman. It's her transforming into her own person with her own beliefs, right? And that's sort of like the cliche of every high school student, but it's true, right? Like they go to school, they graduate, and someone gives you a piece of paper that says, congratulations, you graduated high school, and that is an achievement to be proud of, but the deeper story that runs underneath all of that is you like kind of transforming yourself and you putting in the work, and that's the real significance of doing it, right? It's good to get that paper, and if you want to go to college, you need that piece of paper. But, at the end of the day, the stuff that's really going to stick with you is the stuff that changed you as a person. All right, so let's delve into these reading questions. Just briefly want to just note how much they're worth and just give you some feedback on what you should be doing to answer them. All right, so what is the chorale? Okay, now that's a 1-mark question. So that's 1 mark, 1 sentence. Tell me what that is. What are we talking about? What is your interpretation of the poem on page 40? 2 marks. So you need a little bit more. That's the poem that Nancy writes, okay? So we see Nancy, she pulls up her notebook, and she's got this poem, and then we get to read a bit about it. So you need to interpret that poem, right? And, for bonus marks, you can talk about some of the poetic devices. We talked about going way back to Unit 1 and talking about, I keep confusing my two courses. We didn't do that poem in this class, but you know, just thinking about you know like the elements of narrative apply a bit to a poem, right? You know, like is there a conflict in her poem? Is there a theme of her poem? What kind of imagery is she using? What kind of symbolism? What does the poem tell us about Nancy's inner world? What does it tell us about the story, right? There's lots of angles you could take on that. What incident in this chapter really upsets Nancy? What is Barry's reaction and why does he feel that way? Okay? So so step 1, you have to name or describe the incident. And then and then step 2 is, again, you gotta name and describe the reaction and explain it. And this is a pattern that is going to be happening over and over again when you analyze a piece of literature. When you're analyzing a novel, when you're breaking it down, you are constantly identifying a specific part of the book, something somebody said, an incident, a description of a setting, a description of a person, someone's inner thoughts, and at the end of the day, that's mostly what you're doing. You know, in chapter 17, you know, Nancy, or let's do you know, a real, like, you know, in chapter 12, Nancy struggles with ... She feels this way because ... right? So you're identifying stuff that's in the text. Remember, that is the explicit information, right? So if something is explicit, that means it's in the text. And you and I can't argue over what's in the text. If I flip to page 17 and say read the first sentence, it's going to be the same in every book, right? But the implicit stuff, that's what's not said. That's reading between the lines, right? And that is the whole point of reading books, especially reading novels, right? There's lots of people out there who basically talk about, like, reading a novel, reading poetry. It's almost like solving a puzzle, right? The author gives you all the pieces. They give you the text. They give you the chapters. It's your job to read it and figure out what the story is really about, right? That's kind of the game you're playing, right? Is here's all this stuff. Now you got to figure it out. What's the real meaning, right? What's the true meaning of this story? You have to make the connections. You have to read between the lines. You've got to put it all together. You've got to do some thinking, right? So that's really what we're doing here. Chapters 6 and 7. Comment on Nancy's encounter with Pat Antoine. You notice it's her last name. It's her cousin, right? Who comes along to support Nancy? What is Nancy's reaction to what is said to her? So let's see. That's 2 marks. Barry's disappearance and passing at the end of this chapter only adds grief to Nancy's feelings of confusion, bewilderment, and anger, and she wants to go away. What important advice does Bernice Wu have for Nancy near the end of chapter 7? 2 marks. So I would argue that since that is worth 2 marks, I would give a student a mark for identify the advice. So tell me what the advice is, and then say why or how how is it important? How is that advice important, or why? What it's anybody can give advice, right? And that advice can be great, can be harmful, it can be meaningless, it can be confusing, it can be life-changing, right? But if you give someone important advice, then there's a reason for that. There's a reason why your advice is deemed important. All right, that's probably. Let's do one more, and then we'll talk about our descriptive paragraphs. What is George's main concern when he comes by to see Nancy at their house? 1 mark. What's his main concern? Why is he there? Basically, why is he there? He's not there to get a cup of tea, right? He's not there to mow the lawn. Why is he there? Who is old Mrs. Schmidt? What does Nancy's father have in mind when he mentions her name? Who is this woman, and why does Nancy's dad bring her up? What is symbolic about the purpose of the bear's tooth necklace which Nancy's father gives her at the end of the chapter? So what's the significance of this necklace? Why is the necklace important? If you look at the cover of the book, Where the Rivers Meet, you'll see a nice sketch. Looks like it's done in like pencil crayon of Nancy, standing in front of what I think is Creighton Secondary School. You've got a little bit of the river, a little bit of a white picket fence, and around Nancy's neck is the bear tooth necklace, right? So you can see it. She's wearing it in that picture. So that bear tooth necklace has a lot of significance, okay? So, I'll give you a couple of hints to think about it's not just any bear, right? What tooth? What bear did we get that tooth from? And who got the tooth, right? Who pulled the tooth out of that bear's mouth and turned it into a necklace, right? That's the importance, right? And that's chapter 8. And that necklace comes up later in the story too. So it's a very important symbol. You could also connect that with the teeth that Nancy talks about when she's describing the mountains of British Columbia and near her town, right? She describes them as gigantic wolves' teeth that are about to devour the whole town, right? It's very powerful imagery. All right, so let's see. I was going to talk about the chapter reflections, but I want to devote more time to key question 25. So if we have time, I'll come back to this, but if not, I'll see how long this takes me. All right, key question 25, descriptive paragraph writing. So if we look at our unit assignment, it reads as follows. You have to write 1 page, handwritten or printed. You need to write a rough copy for 10 marks and a final copy for 10 marks. So describe in paragraph format a circumstance or situation in which you have found yourself recently or in the past where you experienced conflict. In your piece of writing, tell what type of conflict it was, internal or external, and how you responded to it. Was this conflict resolved? What have you learned from the experience? And so if you flip to key question 25, that's page 14 of your unit handout, you will see that they have what I've just described to you. But if you flip the page, so what we're talking about here is we're talking about conflicts, right? So internal conflicts and external conflicts. And actually, no, what I wanted to draw your attention to was on, if you go to page 13 of your unit handout, there's the discussion of conflict as it relates to cause and effect, okay? So when we have conflicts in our lives, so remember, conflict is basically, at the root of it, a conflict is something that makes things difficult for you, and it's a problem to be solved. You or a character in a story sometimes might be the same thing if you're telling a story about your life, but there's something you want, there's something you don't want, or there's a problem in your life, or a situation that has to be resolved. Something has to be fixed, and because that conflict is in your life, it leads to consequences, right? So there's a cause and the effect, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about here. So, um, what happens as a result of this conflict, and how, if any way, is the conflict resolved? So before we do that, we have to delve into the difference between internal and external conflict. So an internal conflict is the person having to rely upon inner strength and courage to overcome a certain situation. So what we're talking about here is a personal matter of some kind within his or her control to be resolved. So that's a really important definition here. So the internal conflict is one that you or the main character can fix on their own somehow, right? And the internal conflict can be completely internal. It can only occur in someone's mind, right? So the thing to be overcome is it's affecting one person, and they have the power to control it and to deal with it. It's an inner conflict. The external conflict is a situation to be resolved is outside or beyond one's immediate control. And the conflict might involve only one person, but there are outside forces, the external forces that have to be overcome to solve the conflict. Like nature, for example. So like we have an example in the unit material of a snow machine breaking down several miles from home and a blizzard comes on, right? So it's one person, but they may not have the means to solve it, and the situation is not in their immediate control. There's nature is getting involved, right? And so I would say that, like Nancy from our novel Where the Rivers Meet, she has inner conflicts, and there's things that she has things in her life that she has control over, and she does take control of her life and she deals with them. But she has many external conflicts too, like the racism and the oppression and the injustice affecting her people. They are beyond her immediate control, and they are conflicts that she can't really deal with by herself. But as we see, she can make an attempt to, and she can definitely inspire other people to join in, right? So that's the internal versus the external conflict. So creating an outline for a descriptive paragraph. So I thought we could try this out. We can keep these elements of narrative fresh in our mind. So I'll do one for myself. So the characters are me. That's your teacher, Mike Laverty. Let's see. And then we need a setting, a plot, a conflict, and a theme. And let's see, the narrative is going to be first person. So I'm going to use the first person voice. I'm going to use I and me and my, right? All right. And the setting will be, maybe we'll do an example from a previous career of mine. So this would be, maybe I could do the public library in Sulikout. My conflict is going to be an external conflict. And the plot is going to be let's see, homeless people in the building, and then I'll just say controversy. Controversy. Have I spelled that right? And the theme is going to be, helping people. Kind of similar to our novel, helping people in justice. And then maybe, different people's expectations. So I wasn't really sure what example from my life I would do, so I kind of did that purposely. I left that part off, but I wanted to bring up a little story about my life. So this is when let's just say the CEO, in charge. So there was a time in my life where I was running a small public library in Sulakaut. I was the CEO, and we had an issue where we had computers and we used to charge money for people to use them, and then we changed our policy and made the computer use free. And there's a large homeless population in Sulakaut, and they wanted to use our machines and go on Facebook and talk to their relatives and things like that. So it was an external conflict, and the conflict we were getting was like complaints from people complaining about them being in the library. And yeah, so it was a very complicated situation where I would say that a vast majority of the homeless people coming into the building were very kind and respectful, and a lot of them had problems with addictions, and when they were intoxicated they would usually leave without complaint. Sometimes we had incidences, so it was it was a very stressful time in my life, and I was trying to figure out how to do the right thing. I wanted to protect people, and I didn't want people in the building if they were intoxicated. So I was concerned with public safety, but at the same time, and I believe this to this day, that a library is a place where you help people. And if someone is homeless and they come into the building and they're not intoxicated, you should open your doors to them and help them and let them come in and treat them like human beings and things like that. So I was getting a lot of pressure from police, from the municipality, from a lot of from other people in the library complaining. So that was my conflict. So that's the one that I would talk about myself for this assignment, right? So it's got to be. Let's go back. So it's a one-page handwritten. So the type of conflict, how you responded to it, was the conflict resolved, and what have you learned from the experience, right? So when it comes time to actually writing this thing, it would be my conflict. So when you write a first draft. So when we write a first draft of anything, when we do a rough copy, this is where the writing process comes in. So we're doing step one of the process. We're planning, and I want to do what I call sentence. I call them sentence starters, right? And so what you do is you write down a list of sentences that you're going to write about, right? And And this is a great way to get started, especially if you've got writer's block, if you're having a hard time jumping in to what you're going to talk about. You basically give yourself instructions. So that this is going to be your future self. So it might be 10 minutes from now, it might be tomorrow, but I'm going to write one sentence about sentence 1. I introduce my external conflict. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to introduce to my... So sentence 1 will be introduce my external conflict. And it's going to be, that's the short form, is like homeless in library. Step 2. And when I'm doing this planning process, I'm thinking about the question itself, right? So I have to say a circumstance or a situation in which I found myself recently or in the past, right? So I have to say what kind of conflict it was, how I responded to it. So response, resolution, and learned. Okay. So go back to my sentence planner. So so I have to maybe I'll do my I would do explain. I would explain how problems started, maybe / describe Sioux Lookout. And our unique demographics, right? Sioux Lookout is a very unique community. It's one of the most highly educated communities in Ontario. It's much younger than the provincial average, but yet we also have some of the highest substance abuse rates and homelessness rates as well. So it's a very unique community that's got very rich and very poor. So I would explain how the problem started, describe Sioux. Sentence 3 would be my initial reaction / response. Sentence 4 would be like my later response / attempts to resolve the conflict. And then 5 would be to say how it didn't get resolved, because it didn't. It's a big problem. But it didn't get resolved, but I learned ... All right, so this, and trust me, this is very, very useful, and I would suggest that you try this approach when you write this paragraph for yourself, or this when you do this assignment, this descriptive paragraph. I've given myself instructions. Those are the instructions I'm going to do. So I have to write a sentence that introduces my external conflict, a sentence that explains how the problem started, my initial reaction to it, my later response to it, explain that it didn't really get resolved, but I learned ... And then once I've written those first 5 sentences, I'm going to have a rough draft. And then I can go back to my rough draft and I can make it better. I can add things to it. I can take things away. But the sentence planner gets me going. I can write a rough draft. Once I have that rough draft, then I can think about refining it and revising it and changing my word order. And I might actually go in a different direction after I write that first draft. But that's going to get me started. So thanks for tuning in for today. We will do this again next week.